In 1917, a pair of girls 9 and 16 in Cottingley, West Yorkshire, set out into the woods with a camera with the aim of proving the existence of fairies. From this event, they generated many photos. The elder girl, Elsie, with the camera, admitted to it being a hoax many years later, and the event was dubbed the most successful hoax of the 20th century. In April of 2019, the photos went on auction and fetched a sum of £70,000. Despite it being called a hoax, one photograph, Elsie insisted, was genuine until her deathbed. Despite it being an admitted hoax, it captured the excitement and imagination of millions. One newspaper publication at the time wrote, "The recognition of their existence will jolt the material 20th century mind out of its heavy ruts in the mud, and will soon admit that there is glamour and mystery to life. Having discovered this, the world will not find it so difficult to accept that a spiritual message supported by physical facts which has already been put before it." It wasn't so long ago that fairies were regarded as very real beings, and although they have diminished in their power and have been reduced to a more childish regard, there is something to be said about their presence in the collective consciousness of Europeans. Even if you don't know much about fairies, you have an idea of what they are. Today the word fairy does little to communicate the intense passionate nature, the power and the danger of the she being Irish Gaelic for fairy. Fairies themselves are all around us. They are surely more numerous than humanity. They are very powerful, with the ability to become visible and invisible at will. Fairies are supernatural, though they are not incorporeal. They are composed not of flesh, but of a higher material, something light and ethereal that we in our mortal understanding of the world cannot hope to grasp. They do not eat, though they still enjoy a feast full well. They absorb some essence of food and drink through their hands by some means of magic. The fairies are of incredible power, and so it is ill-advised to cross them. They may bring immense wealth and prosperity as easily as they would death and drought and sickness. Fairies often fail to understand mortals. A fairy may see something as a fair payback, but fail to realize that it will cause death, and that mortal never knew in the first place that they had done anything wrong. The Celtic gods themselves are an elite class of fairies, which explains the immense power of both parties. While the Old Irish honored the fairies as the Tuatha De Danann, the race of the tribe of powerful gods that live underneath Ireland, after the Christian takeover of Ireland in 500 AD, society had to decide whether fairies were in league with God or with the devil. It is not my intention on this channel to constantly bash Christianity. However, I must regularly mention its impact given that wherever Christianity and native European folklore met, there was conflict. There were situations where fairies were assimilated with demons, and where they were viewed more positively, they were assimilated with angels. For example, in hostile fairies such as the Buvan She, they are depicted with cloven hooves like the devil, and in the case of typical trooping fairies, they are depicted with wings, as with angels. At certain times and places in Ireland, and especially in Scotland, fairies were outright rejected by the church. Some believed that fairies were terrified of the priest, and that merely saying, "God bless you," rendered them powerless. Fairies were attributed to sudden tripping and sneezing, and that's why you tell someone, "bless you," when they sneeze. It's to scare away whatever fairies or devils caused it. If you saw one of those little tornadoes of dust that form on a windy day, it was surely the works of a fairy. You were also encouraged to say, "God bless you," as to free any souls trapped within. On top of this simple spell, and mind you, that's literally what it is, telling someone "bless you" is in fact a spell, because you're using words that are supposed to have a magic effect. As well as this, baptism and certain charms and herbs protected against the fairies. See my second witchcraft episode for more information about that, link in the description. In cases where fairies were allowed a more favorable seat in Christian canon, they were said to be fallen angels who brought mortals to heaven. and St. Patrick himself said they would be allowed into heaven on the last day of the earth. St. Patrick is a man who was ascended to near godhood, as well as with some other saints. This was no doubt as a means to replace the native Irish gods. In truth, fairies are neither angels nor are they devils. They are the godlike beings that compose the ranks of the Tuatha De Danann, the great gods of old. Calling them devils is an attempt to destroy the old lore, and calling them merely angels is a demeaning method of assimilation. The incredible power of the fairies is a reason to gain their favor. They are generous to those whom they take a liking, and disastrous to those who cross them. Fairies may make crops wilt or grow in plenty. They can control the weather, and compared to mortal men, do just about anything. It is true that fairies may be of poor disposition. That much is not a Christian invention. Fairies were attributed to sneezing, tripping, stealing eggs, making butter go bad, setting fires, and bringing disease and death in men and beast alike. Fairies are blamed for a condition called elf shot, which modern people would be sure to diagnose as a cramp or charley horse. The cause of elf shot, as the name implies, is to have been shot by an elf with an arrow. Elf and fairy are somewhat interchangeable terms, mind you. While fairies would cause plenty of problems to those who unwittingly crossed them, they were just as often helpful. A farmer may wake up with all his crops gathered in the barn for him, saving the day's work, or just as diseases can be given, they were cured. There's a story of a farmer who, whenever he crossed a place he knew fairies to reside in, he would say, "God bless you, ladies and gentlemen." And one day when it rained, they helped him out by putting all of his hay in the barn for him, keeping it dry. Overexcited, he declared they pour him a drink, and this caused the hay to return to the wet field. Some ways to gain the fairies' favor is to leave the last sip of wine in your glass for them, or to leave on the porch milk, wine, and cold potatoes for them. There's a saying, "There's no use crying over spilt milk." I'll bet you've heard this saying, but I bet you never knew that the reasoning behind it is that fairies will still accept it as a gift. There are cases of people who have made good friends out of the fairies around them, perhaps without even knowing, and a neighboring enemy faction of fairies might put a disease on him, only for the fairies to go to war over the man's health. Being immortal, and perhaps not feeling pain, fairies enjoy a good war, hacking and slashing at each other long after the man died just for the sheer sport of it, leaving fields of crops destroyed and covered in fairy blood, even turning mortal people into steeds that they would ride into battle. Fairies never miss a funeral. They're sure to be there stabbing and gouging at each other. What may provoke the fairies are things such as uncleanliness. Keep your house tidy or they will get mad. Similarly, a maiden who would otherwise be pretty with unkempt hair and fingernails will be sure to set them off, since they have an innate appreciation for beauty that is being insulted. Similarly, give a second or two's notice before tossing a pot of dirty water out of the house. Drenching an invisible fairy would be a mistake indeed. There was once a man who would beat his wife every day, so the fairies took the man and beat him until he had more bruises than not. Fairies often uphold a good moral agenda, but sometimes their logic is more foreign to us. A nobleman once gave a peasant a florin to buy him whiskey, and for his service the fairies made it so that if ever he spent the florin, it would come back, so that he always had money. But in another similar case, someone was gifted a reappearing florin, but the cost for it ended up being his son. Fairies don't always understand mortal attachments. It may go over their head how important the bond between a person and their child is. Fairies are immortal, and they don't tend to see the world on a basis of what is mine and what is yours. So they don't place the same value on things. For this, it is advised to leave out milk for the fairies so that they don't just steal your cow outright, since they have no concept of ownership. The world is theirs for the taking. Primroses scattered in front of the doorway or tied to cows' tails will guard the home and cattle from fairies, especially if picked before sunrise. Mountain ash protects against magic, as does garlands of marsh marigolds. The music of fairies is the most beautiful thing in the universe. It is beyond that of human imagining. Mere mortals cannot even fully process its beauty. It is meant for fairy ears alone. Hearing a glimpse of such music leaves you longing for it for the rest of your life, and being allowed a proper listen causes you to forget all love, hate, and anything of the mortal world. And when the last note is played and the song ends, you will fall over dead, having become reliant on the song as though it were a powerful narcotic. The song Calling das Krute Nemo, in English, The Pretty Girl Milking Her Cow, is said to be the result of a mortal hearing fairy music and desperately attempting to replicate it, but utterly failing to replicate its incredible power, despite it, to the mortal ear, being beautiful music. There's a link to the song in the description, since you'd probably want to hear it after that. I may interject that it's absolutely insane that the Wikipedia page for this song doesn't mention that it's from fairies. You'd think that would be like the most important thing, but I digress. Playing this song around a fairy rath will be sure to offend the fairies. It would be a bit like playing church music on a kazoo. It just doesn't quite do their music dignity. Fairy raths are circular stone fortifications found all around Ireland. There's a system of underground tunnels said to link all of them together. If you fall asleep in a fairy rath, when you wake up, your soul will have been replaced with that of an old fairy warrior, and as such will remember the history of the entire earth all the way back to the beginning when the gods created the land. The second you step out of the rath, however, these memories are gone. If you walk 3 times around a rath on a full moon night, you may be lucky enough to come across a fairy palace. A fairy palace's floors and ceilings are composed of gold, its walls of crystal and its pillars of silver. It's every bit as gaudy and spectacular as the fairies themselves. Fairies have an affinity for royalty, and as such each palace has a king, a queen, and a fool. The king of all fairies is the great Fionvara, though the kings and queens of each palace still rule over their own region. The fool is there to keep everyone entertained, but for the month of June they all take off and wander the mortal world. He carries a bowl behind his back, and if he comes across an unfortunate mortal, he cracks them over the head so hard that they will never regain their wits. A possible counter-charm against this is to say to him, "The Lord between us and all harm," though that leans a bit much on the fairies as a demon's idea. Male fairies dress themselves in the green of fields and woods and a red cap, red being the color of magic, while fairy women prefer to dress in white. Foxglove may be used for their hat, though it should be mentioned that fairies are not always small. It's sort of inconsistent. Fairies are all very beautiful, and they will have relationships with mortals from time to time. The resultant child of such a union has all the splendor of a fae, but lacks the immortality of their fairy parent. However, fairies may gift people with immortality from time to time, though this is less common in recent history. If you take a green rush and twist it into a circle and look through it, you can see fairies, though you will lose sight in that eye. A far better thing to have on your person is a 4-leaf shamrock, the possession of which allows you to see the fairies with no real drawback. There was once a village where everyone was awestruck because a chicken was carrying behind them a 10-foot wooden beam. Someone with a shamrock in their pocket, however, knew at once that it was only a small twig and a fairy was playing a prank on them. Fairies have a fondness for pranking mortals. A company of fairies once invited a mortal to a feast, an offer you'd be foolish to turn down. When he arrived, they showed him an old woman basted up like a turkey and made it out to be like that was their meal. In horror, the man fainted, but when he awoke, they informed them that it was only an illusion. Rather than human flesh, they prefer to feast upon nectar and dew, though since these commodities are in short supply, they tend to eat food typical of humans. The only difference is, as with all things of the fairies, it's 1,000 times better. Much like as with fairy music, a fairy feast will leave you pining away forever, although just adding a pinch of salt undoes this charm. Unfortunately, as with the last two episodes on witchcraft, the script for this ended up being really long. The final video ended up being about a half-hour long, and I just figure that's a bit much, so I'm going to split it in half and kind of leave you hanging here, but I'll have the next half of the video in a week. My plan will be to upload every Thursday. The next episode, I'm going to talk about fairy changelings as well as Tir na Nog, and it's genuinely really interesting, so I really hope you stick around and watch that. With that, thank you so much for watching. See you guys next time.